we are here to discuss Vincent Devanne's new book, L'adieu au voyage, l'ethnologie française entre science et littérature, which has just been published by Gallimard in the Bibliothèque des Sciences Humaines collection. And there's a nice serendipity for this event this evening, because just last week there was a review, a glowing review in Le Monde des Livres of Vincent Devanne's book, which characterized it as une étude éblouissante, and which furthermore insisted on the fact that it was not just a literary analysis of ethnographic texts, but also an extremely ambitious reflection on the history of literature, on the history of anthropology, and on the history of the relationships, complex relationships between them. And so we will touch on some of those ambitions tonight, I think. So Vincent and I are going to have a somewhat informal exchange with some questions about the book. Then we're going to open the floor for your questions. And I would also like to let you know that we were hoping to have copies of the book available for you to buy this evening, but they were, as usual, held up at customs. So we do have one copy of the book and also a copy of the Pléiade edition of Lévi-Strauss's works that Vincent coordinated and prefaced, and also an order form such that you can order the book with the free shipping and a discount. So don't hesitate to take advantage of that, and also to take a look at the books that are on display over there. And then we will have a reception, since this is also an occasion to celebrate the publication of the book, to which you are all cordially invited. So Vincent, I thought we could start with talking a little bit about titles, important part of the book. I know that at one point you had considered the title Les deux livres de l'ethnographe, and then eventually came to this title, L'adieu au voyage. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some of the ideas that are behind those titles, and some of the discussions that you had with your editor that led you to come to the title L'adieu au voyage.
Yeah, so thank you for everything. Thank you, Shane. Thank you, John, for making this possible. So the original title was Les deux livres de l'ethnographe, meaning the two books of the anthropologist, obviously. And because the starting point, the point of departure was some sort of bibliographic curiosity. I was studying the writings of the first generation of French ethnographers. By first generation, I mean the first generation for which fieldwork was a requirement. So it was the generation trained by Marcel Mauss, mainly in the 20s. So I was studying those writings, and I came to realize that most of the ethnographers, almost all of them, were writing, of course, a very specialized monograph about certain right, certain linguistic family, certain social manifestation. And in addition to that, almost all of them published a more literary account of their field experience. Some sort of, so it was published by it was intended for a wider audience. It was published not by the Musée de l'Homme or the Société des Americanistes, by Gallimard, Plomb, Grasset. So of course the question was, why two books? Why? What is the relationship? Why do ethnographers feel the need for a literary supplement to their scientific work? And maybe I should give some examples. The two most famous examples are the one of Lévi-Strauss, who wrote La vie familiale et sociale des Indiens Nambikora, so social and familial life of Nambikora Indians in 1948, and then 7 years later gave Triste Tropique. You also have Michel Léris giving La langue secrète des Dogons de Sangha, which is the scientific work, and then L'Afrique fantôme, published by Gallimard. So that was the first title, Les deux livres de l'ethnographe, and that was the first idea. And then the editor, Pierre Nora, did not like it. He thought that it was not sexy enough, I guess. Les deux livres de l'ethnographe. And then ethnographe is not, I don't know, it was not fun enough. And so I guess he's reliable on those matters. So he told me, I say that because he was actually the one who coined the phrase les mots et les choses for Foucault, because Foucault wanted to entitle it L'ordre des choses, but the order of things, which is the English translation, but it was not possible for juridical reason. And L'ordre des choses was a novel So he had to coin another title, and he came up with Les mots et les choses. So I thought, well, he knows about title. So and so he said, what would be great is that you have voyage in the title. And I said, well, voyage. The thing is, one of the claims of the book is that there is discontinuity between the tradition of travel writing and anthropology. So if voyage is in the book, then it has to be in a sort of critical way, or then it has to be denied. So I didn't want to call it La fin des voyages because it was kind of a cliché, and maybe too Lévi-Straussian in a way. And so I called it L'adieu au voyage, which is still an allusion to Lévi-Strauss, because at the end of Tristotropique you have this famous exclamation, adieu sauvage, adieu voyage, farewell savages, farewell voyages, explorations. So that's why the book, the title came from.
And you insist in the book on the fact that the division between these two books and the way that they are configured is not always the same for the different authors that you're looking at, and that the function of the second book is not always the same. So do you want to give us some examples of those differences?
Yeah, this is something important because, I mean, first of all, the genre of the second book varies. I mean, it can be a memoir, like Tristotropique. It can be some sort of surrealistic diary, like L'Afrique fantôme. It can be very conventional travelogue, like Mexique Terre Indienne by Souster. It can be very grandiloquent chronicle, like Les Burners of Men, Les Flambeurs d'Hommes by Marcel Pagnol. So the second book, are not all similar, but all of them are still explicitly connected to the scientific counterpart. And I think it's important because all those pairs don't line up together. And it's important because it prevents from reducing the relationship between the two books to usual divide, like the objective on the one hand, the subjective on the other hand, narration on the one hand, description on the other hand, explanation on the one hand, interpretation on the other hand. So that's why it's really, I mean, this is an important, important point I wanted to make. And so it shows that you need to really locate each of these pairs in an epistemological context, in a historical context, and not take for granted any given division between science and literature.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and that's actually precisely the next thing that I wanted to ask you about is the review in Le Monde des Livres emphasizes the ambitions of the project, and part of the ambitious nature of the project is the general reflection that you start with about these big categories of science and literature and how they are configured at different periods in literary history and in the history of science. And so one of the things that struck me in reading the book is that you say that in dealing with these, there's certain methodological challenges in dealing with these big categories that are sort of historically changing categories. And you say that you take a lesson from the ethnographer himself, I guess in most cases here, to apply it to your own method as a literary critic or scholar. You want to tell us about that and perhaps reflect more generally on your method in the book?
Yeah, well, no, I just say that in the beginning of the book, that the danger, I talk about the danger of the projecting categories on the two books. And again, trying to recognize, like it's the way it's usually done is that you have Lévi-Strauss writing elementary structures of kinship, and then you have Lévi-Strauss the scientist, and then you have Lévi-Strauss the man, the man with his emotions and his affects, writing Tristotropique because the objectivistic approach of science would prevent subjectivity from expressing itself. So, and the thing is that you could do that about anything. So I thought it more productive just to look at the text. I mean, to start with a very careful history of knowledge, careful readings of the text, situate, locate the text. So, and maybe, you know, distinguish between the generations. The ethnography doing at the Musée d'Ethnographie du Trocadéro in 1928 is not quite the same one that in the Musée de l'Homme in 1938. And it's very different from the one made in the Laboratoire d'Anthropologie Sociale in the 1960s. So, but maybe I should give some more, I don't know, maybe more examples, or I don't know. Just to give a good example to understand how does this divide or distribution work would be Alfred Métro, his book on Easter Island. So Alfred Métro went on in 1934. He went to Easter Island. He spent there 8 months. After he went back to France, and then he spent 2 years in Hawaii studying Polynesians, Polynesian society, and he came up with this big book, Anthropology of Easter Island, 450 pages, with all the details you can imagine. The original text of the legend, the translation, lots of reflections about the language, the culture, the rites, and everything. And then, in addition to that, 1 year later, he publishes Easter, L'Île de Pâques, which is a much more literary account of his fieldwork, which was published by Gallimard in 1941. And so I mentioned that because I think it's good to have examples. And this book, L'Île de Pâques, was considered by Georges Bataille, said, this is a masterpiece. This is a masterpiece, much better than, you know, most of the novels which are published today. So now, of course, the question is, how do you account for this supplement? And so, I don't know, should I keep going on that?
Well, tell us, how can you account for this?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, this in Metro, but all those cases are not parallel. But in the case of Metro was a very attentive reader of Mauss, careful reader of Mauss. And Mauss, one of the great innovations brought by Marcel Mauss in social theory, is that the social fact is a mental fact. It's a moral fact. So, I mean, what makes a society typical is not just material productions, or even social organization, or even juridical rules. What makes a society typical is certain manners of thinking, manners of feeling, which are les façons de penser, les façons de sentir, which are phrases coming from Durkheim actually, and you can trace, you know, how such a phrase like les façons de penser, les façons de sentir is going from Durkheim to the surrealists, because Aragon mentioned them a lot, and then Mauss, Lévy-Bruhl, and so anyway, so you have like several texts by Mauss in which Mauss insists that a society is an atmosphere, and you have an atmosphere, a moral tonality, a moral climate. And so, of course, the question is, how do you account for a moral climate? How do you do that? And Métro, he's the one who was actually saying, okay, we need to do that with a literary technique. He's the most explicit. Really wondering, when he was in Hawaii, he writes a letter to Léris and say, you know what, I want to give the impression of what is the life on Easter Island, and to do that I need to be a novelist. I need to be a novelist, to use the techniques borrowed from the novel. And so there is one of the striking things about this thing is that resurfaces at that time a very, very classical conception of literature, very almost archaic. Literature is just a technique of transmission, restitution of moral and immaterial realities. And even in ethnographic methods in griot ethnographic methods, you have like almost a rhetorical reflection. What stylistic device should I use to transmit, to restitute the atmosphere of a rite? And I thought that's very interesting, because when you think of the exchanges between anthropology and literature, first things you think of, okay, Georges Bataille, André Breton, the avant-garde, primitive art, And indeed, I mean, this is really an important aspect of the relationship between anthropology and literature. Like Document, the journal by Bataille, directed by Bataille and Lévis, where you can find signatures by anthropologists and by poets or surrealists. But for the ethnographers, the relationship to literature is not that. I mean, so there's a sort of a chiasma here, because writers are looking toward anthropology because they like the documents, they like the realities, they like what is brought by anthropology, because it unsettles our expectations, it reveals aspects of the experience which are denied in everyday life. That's why Bataille reads the ethnographer. But the ethnographer, they love literature just because literature is a rhetorical technique to transmit an atmosphere, to transmit a moral tonality, a moral climate. And to go back to Métro, Easter Island is a great book. Unfortunately, the version of the text, which is now for sale, is not the one which was originally published, which was much more literary. And Métro is speaking in the first person, and talking about his childhood and how he was in love with his informer and all that. But he skipped that.
So he rewrote it?
He rewrote it, yeah, he rewrote it. And so, but the thing is that he's really, he's doing everything he can to recreate, I don't know how to say that, to revive the atmosphere of the past Easter Island society. And so using free indirect speech, very long descriptions, ekphrases, like the rhetorical figure, this kind of thing. I don't know where we started, but that's
yeah. No, so what you just said gives us some sense for how the specificity of anthropology puts it into a particularly vexed relationship with literary traditions. Because in the introduction you sketch out some of the ways that science and literature gets configured in other domains, but anthropology has a sort of particular problem with this relationship to literature through the atmosphere, the emphasis on atmosphere and moral climates.
Yeah, the thing is, actually, you would find, I mean, most of the 19th century social sciences, and not even social sciences, but let's say history, for example, or geography, were facing this difficulty of restitution, the problem of how do you account for a reality which is not always tangible. And you found that, so there is this, there is all those methods, by the positivists. I mean, all this comes from a sort of positivistic definition of social sciences. And if you read like historians such as Segnobos or Langlois, there is all this like they write very long methods to teach you how you do history. And in the end, there is a very small chapter about how would you write. So it's all about critique of sources, criticism of sources, critique of sources, establishing of facts, how do you establish a document. And then in the end, you have like 2 paragraphs saying, okay, what about the style? How would you, expose your results? And most of the time they say, okay, you have to be wary of les fleurs du style, les fleurs en papier. So some sort of cautious. You don't. Let me say that in French because. So il faut toujours bien écrire. Il ne faut jamais mal écrire. Toujours bien écrire, mais ne jamais s'endimancher. That's what you find at the end of s'endimancher meaning having like putting.
Dress yourself up in your Sunday outfit, rhetorically speaking.
Thank you. So this is so you find this type of sort of scruples at the end of a lot of methods, and it's the same for literary history, geography. Vidal de la Blache, you would find same sort of recurring thing about how do you finally expose the results of your investigations. But the thing with anthropology is that I think anthropologists are facing this difficulty more directly, because for two reasons. Because of their field experience, which is still remain the core of the discipline. And then because they really want to account for mental, because of this idea that the social fact is mental. So in a way, I think anthropology reveals an inherent difficulty of some sort of a documentary paradigm, which was applied to immaterial realities, and so this difficulty was sometimes surfacing in sciences such as history or literary history, but it suddenly burst out with anthropology, and yeah. So and what's striking is in the discourse of the anthropologists of the 30s is that on the one hand, I mean it's a very contradictory discourse, because on the one hand they keep saying, okay, we're not writers, we're scientists. Il n'y a pas de place ici pour les effets esthétiques. This is one of the first sentence by Griol in his Méthode de l'ethnographie. So we are not one of those exotic, travelers giving impressions of their travels. But at the same time, they keep complaining that the ritual masks, the tools, or whatever behind the window panes of the museum are unable to give an idea of the atmosphere of the society they've stayed with. So, and I try to follow this. Historically follow this scruple, through different disciplines, but mainly, with anthropology, because it's the first page of Marcel Mauss' Manuel d'ethnographie keep saying, okay, ethnography, anthropology, est une science d'enregistrement. You record and you establish, you record, and you establish documents. And he says, un ethnologue doit être un statisticien, un chartiste, I can't remember all the, he lists all the qualification, all the abilities an anthropologist is supposed to have. And then in the end, he says, and maybe also a novelist, able to, et peut-être aussi un romancier, able to evoquer an entire society. And and that's why I think Métro was also saying, I need to be a novelist to talk about the historian.
So you talked earlier about this chiasmus with the ethnographers looking to literary traditions and literary techniques, and then the mutual fascination of the literary writers on the other side. And this sort of gives part of the structure of the book, which is divided into three parts. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So so the book is in three parts, because the first part, and they are not. It's not quite. The third part is a little shorter. The first part is really devoted to anthropology and French tradition and French anthropological tradition, and to this mix of attraction and repulsion and rejection of literature. So this kind of scruples I was mentioning, and in a way is a misunderstanding between Bataille and Rivet. Bataille looking for Georges Bataille looking for seeing the document as a way to get out of the representation, and Rivet looking at literature as a way to give a good representation of a given society. So first part of the book. So what's interesting is that it's both fascination and rejection. We are not writers, but at the same time we are the followers of Rousseau and Montaigne, which is something else, which is the way French anthropologists are telling their own history, and they most of the time they affiliate themselves to Renaissance and Enlightenment, and it's interesting because they kind of want to cut loose from the contemporary literature to go back to an ancient conception of literature, saying, oh, remember in the 18th century, science and literature were walking hand in hand. So this is this kind of mix again between attraction and repulsion. And then, so this is the first block of the book. The second book is devoted to specific studies of literary supplements, of second works. So there is an introduction, and then there's one chapter on Métro, one chapter on Griot, one chapter on Léris, and one chapter on Lévi-Strauss. And then the third part of the book is about the same type of mixed feelings, but this time the ethnographer, from the writers towards the anthropologists. So and you can find very similar. So there is some sort of mirror structure, because it's a very similar attraction and distrust.
They're disturbed by.
Yeah, they are both in a way. They are very interested in anthropology, and surrealists were the first readers of Lucien Lévy-Bruhl. And in the Nouvelle Revue Française, you have like a special rubric devoted to anthropology. So the writers are really interested, and they are translating, poems from Lacandan Indians from Mexico, or Malagasy proverbs. So they are attracted, and at the same time, they are very wary of anthropology, because anthropology is, in a way, competing with the ambition of literature.
And encroaching on its territory.
Yeah,
on its traditional
territory. And it's on its traditional territory. So, yeah, this is the core of the third part is called the querelle de propriété. So les querelles de propriété, it's a phrase from Ramon Fernandez article 1935, when he talks about, so he's an essayist, one of the leaders of the Nouvelle Revue Française, and he tells the conversation. He starts. I mean, this article is really, really, really interesting. And he starts saying, "Well, I was in Scotland, and I had this great conversation with a sociologist, and we were wondering who has, who is really, who should we believe when we are coming to knowledge of man? Should we believe the poet or the sociologist?" And he says, "Notre querelle avec les sociologues est une querelle de propriété." So meaning that traditionally, knowledge of man was the jurisdiction of literature. And it's pretty explicit in the 19th century, end of the 19th century text, when you have people like Gustave Lançon saying, fortunately, alors, heureusement, la psychologie et les mœurs resteront le domaine inaliénable des poètes et resteront le domaine inaliénable des poètes et des romanciers. So he says, yeah, literature was very general, and then literature saw gradually its territory shrink because of the assaults of sciences. So first of all, mathematics, then physics, then natural history, then history, geography. And he says, fortunately, we still have one thing, which is les mœurs et la psychologie. And you can, and again, in the 20s, in the interwar period, this is a way of presenting literature which is everywhere. Literature has, at some point, Albert Thibaudet, one of the founder of the NRF, or whatever, not the founder, one of the important people in the NRF, talks about la peau de chagrin littéraire. So it's the feeling that literature is actually losing its territory, I don't know, jurisdiction, territory, its domain. And Ramon Fernandez points it very rightly when he says, okay, notre querelle avec le sociologue est une querelle de propriété. So this gives the pattern of the third part of the book, which is, so I follow through from 1895 until 1967. So it's not like a linear history. I just give like snapshots. So I take different quarrels. The first one is the quarrel with Lançon, Durkheim, and Agathon against sociology. Then you have André Breton. Then you have André Breton and the ethnologist. Actually, André Breton contesting the ambition of Métro to know Easter Island, saying, well, the anthropologists are unable to know Easter Island because of leur regard glacé. Le regard glacé de l'ethnologue leur interdit the frozen gaze forbid them or prevent them from grasping anything. So that's the way Breton traces the thing. You have also Bataille reading so this is the opposite. Bataille reading Tristotropique and saying, okay, Tristotropique is actually the proof that once anthropology is done with its scientific work, it has to become literature. So you have all those back and forth movements, and then it goes up to Barthes and the two sides of Barthes, Barthes the structuralism, and then Barthes claiming for, in this famous article, de la science à la littérature, which is to me just another way to frame the querelle de propriété, not focusing on poetry or man, but focusing on écriture. But it's still the same debate. So yeah, this is the structure of the book.
And so let's talk a little bit about Lévi-Strauss. There's an important chapter in the second part, as you've mentioned, devoted to Tristotropique, and then, of course, you worked on the Pléiade edition. So, I'm curious, since that is a sort of monumentalizing gesture with respect to Lévi-Strauss and canonizing him as a literary writer in a certain sense, I'm wondering how you see the relationship between that gesture and between your work on that edition and then your reading of Lévi-Strauss in the chapter, in the book. Is because part of the work of doing the Pléiade is to make a division within the corpus and decide which texts are to be included as literary or canonical literary texts.
Yeah. Well, indeed. I was working on the Pléiade before finishing this book, and working on the Pléiade, and also reading. Seeing the way the Pléiade was received fueled my reflection. It gave me a lot of things to think of, because indeed the most usual reading of the Pléiade, so the Pléiade was met with an unexpected success, which is really surprising given the text. The texts in the Pléiade are not that easy, and they are not even the easiest part of Lévi-Strauss' work. But still, it was as far as the sales go, it was a success. And the reception in the press was to say, okay, now we are getting rid of elementary structures of kinship. We are getting rid of the 4 tiring volumes of the mythology, and we have the most, the man, Lévi-Strauss the man. We have Lévi-Strauss without the structures. That's cool. That's Lévi-Strauss Lévi-Strauss without the structuralism, and so that's the way it was read. And to me, it's a very unfaithful reading, both to Lévi-Strauss thinking and to the volume itself, because actually the volume, the collection, in the collections you have The Savage Mind is one of the most difficult texts by Lévi-Strauss, and also the late texts like The Story of Lynx or The Jill Spotter, La Potière Jalouse, are incredibly difficult. And so I guess I don't know what to say about that.
So you would say that in your choice of text for the Pléiade, you were actually trying to be somewhat true to the argument that you're making in the book, but it was received in a way that distorted that sort of.
The thing is, I didn't make the choice. The choice was made by Lévi-Strauss, which that was the fun part about it, is that he was alive. So he could, he was. He did not intervene at all in the critical edition process itself, but he wrote a letter to Gallimard saying, okay, to me, so Gallimard offered it to be published in the Pléiade, and he did not refuse. And it's very, because I don't know if it's this kind of, I don't know if some living author ever refused that honor. And Gallimard, for example, wanted to have Race and History, which is maybe the easiest text by Lévi-Strauss, although it's not that easy either. But and Lévi-Strauss answered saying, okay, the ideal plan for me would be, and he gave this Triste Tropique, The Savage Mind, and the 7 books which are in the volume. So this was the only intervention in the critical edition process. So I didn't choose it, but and to Lévi-Strauss it was, I don't know, the try to understand the motivation of Lévi-Strauss selecting his own works to be lionized or canonized was part of the puzzles, and especially when you have to write a preface to the collection. But anyway, to me, Lévi-Strauss thoughts quite escape this opposition between science and literature. I mean, he has this idea that there is no such discontinuity between the sort of knowledge you can gain from a literary text and the sort of knowledge you can gain from a social sciences text. So yeah, this is but you can't really, I mean, the reception was still that literature was, I mean, the reception was very, would have really suited Bataille, I think. Because basically what journalists were saying, I mean, reviewers were saying, was actually what Bataille was saying in 1956 about Triste Tropique, saying this is the evidence that when, at some point, anthropology has to give up and, devote to poetry or go into, I don't know, literature.
So I assume you tried to sort of combat that reception when there were all the interviews after this, or not?
Well, that's it's kind of it's kind of fun. Yeah, we say that, and I mean, not people. I mean, still the introduction is a little bit about that, and I hope that in the end, it will. We will. I don't know. It's hard to fight some sort of a. It's a powerful machine, media. So when everyone is saying, "Oh, that's great, we are getting rid of the structure," you can say, "Well, no, Lévi-Strauss has to be taken seriously." But anyway.
So you are, as most people here know, teaching in the Department of French and Romance Philology here at Columbia, and you've been here for a couple of years. And so I'm wondering sort of how the experience, you insist in the book on the exception française, both with respect to the conception of ethnography that is quite different, gets played out differently than in the United States and in Great Britain, for example, and also the specificity of the French conception of literature.
Yeah.
And so, from a more biographical perspective, I'm wondering if your experiences here in the academy or more generally living here have affected your sense of that exception française or the sort of American, if the American approach to anthropology has.
Well, I don't. This is. I mean, thank you for mentioning that, because this is. I know that the talk and presentation was entitled French Anthropology, but it's one of the important things I came to realize is that the way the issue literature and anthropology is framed greatly varies according to the national traditions. So my point is that it's not quite the same here in the US and in Great Britain and in France. Should I say something about? I don't know. Are we running?
We have some time. So.
Okay, so just a word about this French specificity. On the anthropological side, it's a very philosophical anthropology. it's again, I mentioned the fact that it was, that all the ethnographers are nostalgic of the Enlightenment, or even more than the Enlightenment, the Renaissance. So they really think of themselves as the reenactment in the 20th century of a tradition which had been lost at the end of the 18th century. So they have this very theoretical conception of anthropology, which you can recognize in the typically French objects. Le système de pensée, les Vibrules, système de kinship systems, savage mind, all that. It's not like les régimes fonciers, I don't want to say that, but which would be like the typical British object. So there is, and the downside of that is, of course, that the French anthropology has trouble coping with empirical realities. This is the main reproach coming from the US. I mean, as soon as the 20s, people like Robert Lowy or Alfred Kruber were saying, okay, guys, that's great, all those things, all this thought about representation, but maybe you should do a little fieldwork now. And and actually, Lévi-Strauss, when he was here in New York at the beginning, around 45, 47, he wrote like this long, very powerful article about called French sociology, and it's an answer to this critique coming from, especially the US. And one of the things that Lévi-Strauss says is that we are catching up. We are catching up. That's true. And he has this very, in a way, very pretentious retournement, saying, okay, British anthropology has collected so many facts that now they will need someone, to organize this chaos. So you actually need a theoretical anthropology now. So there is this. So this is for the French anthropological specificity. And as far as literature goes, the thing is that French conception of literature is literature is an absolute. It's an absolute. It's not. That's why. I mean, the literature is not like a culture which would be in dialogue with scientific culture. The British patterns inherited from the 19th century, of the idea of the two cultures. It's something which is deeply foreign to French tradition, and also as is foreign to the French tradition, all the development, even until now, in the academia, like the science war, is something which, for some reason, did not affect at all French academia, and this partly comes, I think, from the fact that literature is not a culture. C'est la forme accomplie de la pensée. It's the ideal, even for the writers, but also for the scholars and the philosophers. And Bataille is right. I mean, when he's right when he says that. Yeah, he has like very similar phrase to that. And so literature has a sort of essential ambition, which is to Phil mentioned in the annual department newsletter the phrase the sentence by Madame de Staël, saying la littérature soit tout ce qui concerne l'exercice de la pensée dans les écrits. So everything which regards the faculty of thought in the writings, and indeed, and that's why the writers are so feel so uncomfortable with the development of anthropology, is that their ambition to embrasser tout ce qui concerne la pensée was kind of called into question by the anthropological ambition. And in a way, you can even go further and think of French literature in the 30s, so going back to something more specific, more historical. French literature in the 30s is characterized by a movement which is trying to regain this this ability to think of everything human. Nothing is foreign to literature. And you can think of that, you can think of NRF, Nouvelle Revue Française, in that way. You can think of surrealism as a way to, again,
regain,
reconquer a territory which had been threatened by the growth of social sciences. By the peau de chagrin. So yeah, and your question?
Yeah. Well, there was the autobiographical aspect. But you can discuss that while you're having a drink, perhaps afterwards. I guess my last question before opening it out to all of you would be, of course, there's a certain amount of concern recently with the status of the humanities, not only in the academy in the United States, with recent events such as SUNY Albany cutting their French and a number of other important humanities programs, also in Great Britain. And it seems to me that so a number in our department we're talking about this issue and possibly planning to try to respond to it with the conference. It seems to me that your book has quite a bit to say about these issues of how one might think about the status of the humanities in relation to the social sciences and the hard sciences in the academy. Do you feel that?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's no political statement in the book, but still, if it aims to show something, is that the idea of autonomy of both the idea of autonomy of sciences as well as autonomy of literature are just illusions. That they are deeply intricate, and it's really it's a mistake, but also it's an illusion to think of humanities as something for aesthetic pleasure and moral education on the one hand, and then like hardcore sciences for applications and be useful in the world. Because actually, I think if you think of a society in terms of discursive spaces, then you can come to realize that these discursive spaces are really connected together, and that the connection is pretty intricate sometimes. That there is a deep connection between the museum-based anthropology of the 30s, or and when I say that, it's the positivistic ideology in general on the one hand, and literary attempts, contemporary literary attempts. So, what I would say is that thinking of humanities just as something you would have for leisure on weekends and before going to bed, it's just like nice readings. It's just a complete mistake. Not only about literature itself, but also about science. About the way science works. And not to mention the totally naive conception of science as a theory, and then having applications as if science was progressing only autonomously, and then being applied to reality. All this it's really bad thought.
And do those I said it was my last question, but one more. Do those ideas? How do those ideas affect your teaching? Do they come into the classroom? Because I can see clearly that that's going on in your research. But when you're teaching, is there a way of bringing that thinking about discursive spaces into the classroom? Because of course it's much more difficult to read the types of texts that you're dealing with in your book in a literature class, certainly.
Yeah, well, I not in itself, I guess, but I try to always fuel, especially when I was teaching Lit Hum, try Lit Hum, Literature and Humanities, which is the great books, great books class, trying to fuel in some sort of historical context, I know it's kind of a cliche, but still, it's really important to get a sense of like context being a very vague thing, but the type of expectations of the reader at that time, the conceptual landscape in which each writer is inscribing himself, this kind of thing. So I guess that would be the answer.
Okay, I'm sure that there are questions from the audience. Yes,
Sorry, I still have a question. You mentioned